I'm really pleased to welcome our guest. He is the Vice President and General Manager of the Strategic Innovation Group at Cisco, Maciej Kranz.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here.
So I hope that we can take away some of the real-world implications of what it means when we say that IoT is going to connect devices all over the world, particularly what it means for businesses who are on the front lines of obviously not just developing, but also deploying these technologies. And so, Maciej, I'm wondering, where are we right now when it comes to businesses leveraging IoT?
Good question. I think that IoT has been following sort of a similar pattern. We talked earlier about AI, blockchain, which is primarily focusing on improving existing processes. So that has been sort of the key set of use cases over, I would say, 10 years across industry, from connecting operations, remote operations, predictive maintenance, preventive analytics. So, and I would say we have seen some interesting lessons learned also. The study that we did, I think, a year and a half ago showed that around a quarter of IoT projects that companies have started so far have been concluded successfully. Mm-hmm. So there are some challenges.
Is that success, 25% being completed successfully?
You know, I'm always optimistic. So for me, glass is half full. But there were also interesting lessons learned from the process. We've learned that there are certain technology complexities with primarily most of these deployments have been in the brownfield environment. So how do you integrate with the legacy infrastructure? There were issues with standards. When you think about IoT, it's not one market. There's a collection of markets and sub-markets and ecosystem within these markets. So very fragmented markets that are moving from sort of a proprietary, semi-proprietary structures into standards. But you probably would expect it with any sort of a new technology shifts. The majority of the challenges had nothing to do with technology. It had to do with skills, with workforce, with market structures, with sort of the readiness of organizations to transform.
Mm-hmm. So, Maciej, you know, what types of applications are you seeing directly? You said often IoT is being used to connect more legacy fields. What does that look like?
Let me give you a couple of examples. And by the way, it's sort of interesting because I work for Cisco, but at the same time, we often talk about these number of devices connected. The reality is the businesses actually don't want to connect their devices. They connect them because there's a business need and they want to actually see the ROI, which is why they build these systems, right? But let me give you a couple of examples. One would be, let's say, Harley Davidson. So before IoT, if you wanted to buy a new configuration of a custom bike, which is sort of their value prop, it would often take a year and a half from the time you specify the configuration to actually shipping the new bike. And the reason for it is that you think about it, sort of the environment before IoT was like a archipelago of data islands. So basically, even on the manufacturing floor, the data was not flowing from one station to another. So obviously they started connecting things, they started getting the analytics and the data. In the process, they got multiple organizations working together, IT and OT, operational technology teams and so forth. The long story short, they reduced the time from a year and a half to 2 weeks. They reduced the time to troubleshoot things on the manufacturing floor from a couple of weeks to minutes and improved the bottom line by 3 to 4%. Should I give more examples?
Well, by show of hands, does anyone here have a Harley? And did you notice that the deliveries were quicker? No one. No one.
All right.
Wow, it's living on the edge.
I'm not a Harley fan, by the way, just to be clear, even though I have gone through my midlife crisis. But maybe a couple of other examples, sort of on the other side of the spectrum. You think about a 150-store ice cream chain in India, to sort of going extreme there. They have problems with power outages. They installed generators, but sometimes people didn't turn the generators, and you know what happens. The ice cream melts, a company loses money, but more importantly, by sort of freezing and refreezing ice cream, they create a health hazard. The solution was very simple, and the reason I'm giving you this example is that these IoT solutions don't have to be super complex. You don't have to start with changing your entire organization. In this case, they just dropped self-contained temperature sensors, connected them to the network, to the communication system, and then started sort of messaging, hey, temperature is going up, do something, close the door, maybe there's a power outage. A very, very simple use case, 500% return on investment in the first 12 months. You think about General Motors and Fanuc, 30,000 Fanuc robots in GM factories. They decided to connect half of them, started getting the data and analyzing their systems and improving their systems. They report that the last 2 years they were able to optimize their systems so they had around 100 fewer line stoppages. And for a company like GM, this is their lifeline, right? If they don't produce cars, they don't make money. Every line stoppage on a system-wide basis costs around $2 million. So you can do the math, right? And many, many examples like that.
Right. If we look broadly in terms of efficiencies, is there a certain amount of efficiencies or a certain target that you've seen?
And I don't think it's a scientific number, but I would tell you, because I worked with hundreds of organizations around the world, I would say on average, if you implement some of these systems, not necessarily in the first project, but in the first year or two, you would see probably around 30% productivity improvement, which is huge, right, when you think about it.
Mm-hmm. It's very significant. And what do you think might be possible longer term as IoT continues to be leveraged across different businesses?
Yes, I think that as I mentioned earlier, we've been sort of at this stage of improving existing processes and making them more efficient. But what's exciting for me is the next phase, which we started getting into, which is new value propositions, new business models, new markets. And here you get into sort of a combination of Internet of Things and all the other buzzwords, so AI, blockchain, edge or fog computing. And if I can explain sort of the bit of a connection here. So think of IoT as sort of your body, right? And AI is the brain. So IoT provides the data, machine learning or some of the deep learning algorithms sort of you train the brain, and then in some cases the inference system actually will ask the IoT to execute on these systems. So IoT and AI sort of have this symbiotic relationship. When you think about fog computing or edge computing, often we talk about, there was a discussion earlier about cloud. Well, this is sort of a distributed cloud. If you think about connecting vending machines directly to the cloud, you can do it every couple of days, every couple of packets go through. Hey, please come over, replenish the supply. Not very sort of real-time or bandwidth-intensive application. But when you think about the oil rig, 100,000 sensors, a couple of terabytes of data, it doesn't make sense to take the data to the cloud. You basically take a cloud to the data and you process the data locally. When you add AI on top of that, you can run inference algorithms on GPUs, but increasingly on FPGAs, ASICs, and even on the sensors themselves. So you can distribute that functionality. And then blockchain, obviously, single source of truth. Lots of applications from, like at Cisco, we're running basically a system that we detect counterfeits, right? So you look at provenance and genealogy, and you can figure these out. So think about drones, right? The first wave of drones was just somebody remotely running the bird, collecting the data, and then downloading the data. The next phase was around sort of vertically uploading the data, sort of the fog computing kind of a concept. But then you start seeing the next wave, which is swarms of drones actually doing horizontal and vertical communication. And all four of these technologies sort of working together, so you can send these swarm of drones into the mine, identify the gas leak. Hopefully they can help us with fire, dropping the fire detergent, or identify people during hurricanes. So these are sort of new applications.
And by show of hands, how many investors here are invested in tech names that have hitched their wagons to IoT or trying to develop IoT solutions?
who hasn't pitched their IoT story?
I mean, I would say a fair amount. Well, I mean, I think you bring up a good point, which is that it is a buzzword, and it has turned into, basically this marketing tool. I'm wondering, from your perspective, besides Cisco, of course, I'm sure you love to talk your book, what other tech companies do you think are most poised to take advantage of IoT, and also are just, from an innovation standpoint, doing the best job?
Yeah, and I think that it's important to remember, again, IoT is just a technology tool, right? And the bigger trend here is sort of a digital transformation of the enterprises, but also change of ecosystems, moving from sort of vertically integrated, one company does it all model, like in industrial world, for example, into ecosystems of horizontal, vertical, and regional players developing solutions. So from that perspective, you have horizontal players, obviously infrastructure, so Cisco, Qualcomm, Intel, all the data players, right? So SAS, Teradata, SAP, Oracle, they're focusing on it because at the end of the day, as we talked earlier, IoT is about generating the data, and it's about making sure that you can build systems that allow you to make decisions based on data. All cloud providers, we talked about Amazon earlier, but actually Azure is actually doing quite really well in IoT, especially in industrial world. Google as well, and then the vertical players. So Rockwell Automation has been sort of a leader in this standards-based approach in industrial world, but you see now pretty much all the players sort of tagging along. So if you go to Hanover Fair, and I'm just talking about industrial side of IoT, 10 years ago you would not see any of these players participate. All the verticals were there. Now if you go there the same, and you see basically all the tech horizontal players and vertical players like Rockwell, Honeywell, Emerson, Schneider, putting together solutions, which is very exciting for me.
There's been some, rumblings from some server makers, companies like Dell Technologies, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, that have said recently, told investors, we are going to, continue to grow in the future because of technologies like IoT. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how plausible that is, that those companies will have, a big play in IoT, compared with a company like Intel, for instance, which has been working on this for a long time.
I don't think I can speak for these guys, to be honest, but in general, I believe there are opportunities for system vendors like HP, Dell, and others, right? And but one of the lessons learned over the last couple of years is that you have to pick your play. Initially, in this sort of IoT realm, everybody wanted to do everything, and they found out that you better stick to your knitting, right? And from that perspective, that would be sort of probably the advice that I would give them if they ask me, which is stick what you do to what you do well, and your success will be determined how effectively you build the ecosystem and how you're leveraging the ecosystem. Because on the average, if you think about it, the big trend here is that in healthcare or retail, you still have sort of IT being involved in the process. But in a lot of industrial IoT implementations, it's a line of business. Folks that run the assembly lines and all fields, they're making technology decisions. But they want to consume the technology very differently. They actually want to buy a solution to their business problem versus your box, right? So from that perspective, how effectively you actually partner with the ecosystem that has access to this buying center and it allows you to build a complete solution, in many ways determines your success.
Mm-hmm. Some people in our audience might have an Alexa at home or a Google Home device.
I don't.
And I'm wondering where we are on the consumer side of IoT and connected devices versus the enterprise side.
Yeah, and I do have a bias because I basically follow the money, right? So if you look at the stats, I think most of the money is being made on the B2B side. And partly because if you look at B2C, yes, a lot of people have the IoT devices in their home. The question is the business model, right? Right now, its business model is basically making you more sticky to the sales channel or monetizing your data, which only a few companies can do. So, from my perspective, I've been sort of waiting for new business models to emerge that will actually drive sort of a sustainable, scalable adoption of IoT in the consumer space. However, I do believe that over the next 5 years, probably the biggest innovations will happen in the consumer space in IoT. So once we solve the business model problem, hopefully the wave of innovation will happen.
Mm-hmm. And you think that it will drift from the consumer side to enterprise?
I think we'll go both ways, right? But currently, I think we've seen most of the focus from the big tech on the, with these few exceptions, on the business to business, because the ROI is very clear, like the examples I've mentioned, right? So, and I do actually believe that it's useful to sort of think about this as a journey, and what things are monetizable in the next 2 years, and then you move on from there.
Mm-hmm. You said before, one of the crucial things about IoT is that you have to basically pick what your focus is. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to IoT, there's always the hardware side, there's the software side. How is Cisco specifically using IoT, and how does that compare to some of the other significant players like an Intel or a Qualcomm?
Yeah, I mean, at Cisco, I don't want to make it a Cisco advertising opportunity here, but in a nutshell, it's we've been focusing on developing horizontal capabilities in networking security and integrating those into vertical solutions with our customers and partners, right? So we've had very much a horizontal approach from a technology perspective and a vertical approach from the go-to-market and partnering perspective. And I think that approach has actually worked quite well for us, and I would advocate it for any of the horizontal players, as we discussed earlier. Figure out what you do well and build your ecosystem and make sure that you can develop solutions that line of business folks are willing to pay. Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you expressed some skepticism about consumer IoT devices earlier, but...
timing. Mm-hmm. Sort of skepticism in terms of timing. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Got it. Yep. And so how does business address some of the skepticism that people may have broadly about connecting some of their devices and systems, and even perhaps some of the skepticism that the businesses who were not the early adopters of IoT may still have?
Yeah, and I think that my advice usually is, first of all, because one of the first topics that comes up is security. And my advice is just go to your CISO and make sure that you develop a comprehensive before, during, and after security architecture that is embedded into your architecture. And I think we've seen, both on the vendor side and actually on the customer side, a huge change from sort of let's say, security by denial. I hope I'm not connected to sort of taking a more rational approach. So once you've dealt with that issue and have a sort of a rational risk versus investment approach, focus on dream big but start small. So have a big vision, how you want to transform your organization, but then start with very small projects. You're transforming your entire enterprise, and with it you need to transform people and organizational structures and your ecosystems and so forth. So you need to make sure that you sort of pace yourself and don't get too ambitious as you go through the journey, and learn from your peers' best practices and mistakes, and there have been plenty of them actually.
Mm-hmm. And which verticals have you seen that have been, the most eager to jump to IoT? Is it oil and gas and extraction? What other ones are you seeing?
I think traditionally we've seen a lot of process manufacturing and discrete manufacturing, and they've been sort of in the process implementing IoT for a long time. At the same time, the sales cycle is long, right? If you're running an assembly line, you have an opportunity every 7 to 12 years to basically churn it, right? Nobody will churn their robot just because they want an Ethernet jack, right? So they are probably in the most mature stage at this point. We're seeing quite a rapid adoption in building automation over the last 2 years. Obviously, starting to see more in healthcare and retail. Surprisingly, agriculture actually has been popping up more and more as well. So fairly comprehensive.
Right. I guess connected farms. I'm assuming those are not family farms. I'm assuming.
Yeah,
they're big industrial.
I don't know how many of you live here in the valley, but sort of hour and a half south is Salinas, right? And it's actually a lettuce valley, and you can see some fascinating accelerators and how. Just a 10-second anecdote. So I went to this one company that basically produces the majority of packaged lettuce that you buy in the stores in the US. And they've been sort of moving from manual to automated line across the hangar, right? On one side, 25 people working on the line. On the other side, 3 people working on the line. But in the process, you're actually seeing that they're not just automating the line, they're also educating people, so people are upgrading their skills as well. So it's a win-win. And I think we're seeing these kind of approaches. I mean, there's obviously unpredictability and shortage of labor in many of these applications. So people are looking into creative solutions from satellite-guided sort of precision farming to even here in the city, lots of companies looking at indoor vertical farming and so forth.
Right. I mean, the farming space has been a really hot one, and we'll continue to look at how IoT is affecting businesses. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time.
Thank you.